In the glittering halls of Boston's grandest gala, Grace Whitman had never planned to become the center of attention. She was a secretary, blending into the background of corporate power plays and social polish. But when she witnessed an elderly banquet worker being scolded unfairly, something inside her snapped. Who decides what dignity is worth? Who dares to challenge a billionaire without losing everything across the room? Alexander Pierce, 44, a man whose name graced skyscrapers and business magazines, felt a rare disruption to his meticulously controlled world. A single voice, clear, unwavering, had cut through the hum of wealth and privilege. What happens when courage meets power, head on? Can integrity survive in a world where influence is everything? This is a story of confrontation, accountability, and the unexpected connections that emerge when ordinary people refuse to be invisible. From charity gala sparks to quiet morning revelations, from icy boardrooms to snowy park promises, Grace and Alex navigate a landscape where every choice carries consequence. Will one woman's stand reshape the lives of many, and can love, ethics, and service truly coexist in a world ruled by money? If you're ready to discover how a single act of courage can ignite change, hit like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel to begin the journey. The winter air in Boston had left the streets slick with ice and salt, but inside the Fairmont Copley Plaza, warmth and light spilled across the marble floors, glinting off crystal chandeliers. The sound of clinking glasses and soft string music filled the grand ballroom. But Grace Whitman felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had attended galas before, quietly moving among the guests, taking notes, making sure the staff and her fellow employees felt seen. Tonight, however, something drew her attention beyond the usual formality and polite nods. Across the room, near the buffet, an elderly banquet worker struggled to balance a tray of hors d'oeuvres. His movements were deliberate, careful, and yet, from where Grace stood, a high-ranking executive's voice cut through the ambient music like a whip. The man's words were sharp and impatient, criticizing the worker for moving too slowly. Grace's stomach tightened. She recognized that tone, the dismissive, superior voice that made ordinary people shrink. She remembered her father's layoffs, the quiet humiliations her family endured during hard times, and a familiar anger rose up inside her chest. Her hands flexed at her sides. For years, she had been the background figure, moving silently through offices, noticing what others overlooked. Tonight, she decided she would not be invisible. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble. Every eye she passed seemed to linger on her small black dress, unassuming yet firm in its simplicity. She stopped near the executive, positioning herself where the worker could see support, where the room could see someone refusing to look away. "Excuse me," she began, her voice clear enough to carry over the murmurs and the string quartet, yet measured. It was not loud for the sake of attention. It was loud because it was necessary. She told the man that the worker had done nothing deserving of his ire, and that the treatment was both cruel and unnecessary. Her heart thudded, but her hands remained steady. She felt a heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the intensity of speaking truth in a room filled with wealth and power. The crowd froze. Some guests exchanged glances, uncomfortable with the confrontation, unsure how to react. Others, with a secret thrill, shifted in their seats, sensing the rare courage it took to challenge someone so untouchable. The music seemed to fade behind the collective attention, leaving only the voice of a woman who refused to back down. Grace noticed a phone lift discreetly, recording her words. As others murmured in astonishment, she didn't flinch. Every syllable was deliberate. Every pause weighted with unspoken conviction. Alexander Pierce, 44, the host of the gala, the head of Pierce Langford Holdings, turned toward her. His expression was unreadable at first, a mixture of surprise, calculation, and perhaps curiosity. He was impeccably dressed, as expected, his tailored suit perfectly pressed, a handkerchief folded precisely in his breast pocket. Yet his eyes, sharp and gray, lingered on Grace with something that hinted he did not often encounter defiance that was neither sycophantic nor clumsy. He did not snap or shout. He did not wave security toward her. Instead, he studied her, assessing, measuring. A subtle gesture with his hand was enough. The nearby security staff halted, stepping back ever so slightly. The executive who had scolded the banquet worker stiffened, clearly unsettled by the interruption. Whispers rippled through the room. Cameras, discreetly held, pivoted toward Grace. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and admiration. The elderly worker shifted his weight, uncertain, yet the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Grace realized the moment was bigger than a single confrontation. It had become a small stand for decency in a room that thrived on wealth and appearances. Alex's voice finally broke the pause. Calm, commanding, but without threat. He asked for the worker's name. He made a promise that the company would address the issue, that the treatment would be corrected, that respect and fairness were not just words to be displayed in annual reports. The crowd didn't fully know how to react. Some nodded with relief. Some still whispered criticisms, unsure of what had just transpired. Grace stood quietly, her pulse high but controlled, feeling the stirrings of a victory that was subtle yet meaningful. The moment hung suspended in the warm air of the ballroom. Servers paused. The orchestra's strings played a softer tune, and the guests processed what they had witnessed. Phones were discreetly recording, ready to spread the story outside the gilded walls. Grace could feel her heart rate, the small quivers in her hands, and the quiet satisfaction of having done the right thing. She knew this act would have consequences. She had already felt the tug of nervous anticipation, but in that suspended instant, courage outweighed fear. After what seemed like both a long and a fleeting minute, Grace turned back toward the edge of the room. She adjusted her purse strap, exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and began weaving her way back through clusters of stunned guests. She noticed that the air felt lighter, that some of the whispers carried admiration. The elderly worker gave her a subtle nod, his lips twitching in a quiet smile, and Grace felt a ripple of warmth that contrasted the marble chill. The gala continued, though the rhythm had changed. People spoke in hushed tones, speculating on the rare moment when the ordinary confronted the extraordinary. Grace finished her duties, collected her coat, and stepped out into the winter evening. The streets were slick with slush and salt, reflections of streetlights shimmering in puddles. Her breath formed clouds, brief and white, before dissipating into the cold. She walked steadily, her mind racing, aware that morning would bring questions, consequences, perhaps a summons. Yet beneath that anxiety, a seed of empowerment had taken root. Halfway home, her phone buzzed. A meeting request flashed on the screen. She paused on the corner, snowflakes melting on her hair, and looked down at the message. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She had expected a reprimand, not an invitation. The warmth from the gala seemed distant, yet promising. Grace knew that the night's events were only the beginning, and that tomorrow would require more courage than she had summoned in the ballroom. Still, a quiet, resolute calm settled over her as she continued walking, aware that the path ahead, however uncertain, was a path she had chosen. Grace continues through the slushy streets, her mind on the message, aware that her stand tonight has set forces in motion she cannot yet control. She pulls her coat tighter, thinking of what tomorrow might bring, and of the quiet power of a voice that refuses to be ignored. The city at dawn had a way of looking honest. Streetlights reflected on slick sidewalks where salt had begun to melt into the thin morning ice. Steam rose from coffee cups held in gloved hands at bus stops. People moved in a rhythm dictated by habit and necessity, not celebration. Grace Whitman walked among them, coat wrapped tightly around her, scarf tucked to shield her neck. Her mind replayed the gala from the night before, the way she had spoken up, the silence that followed, and the subtle nod from the billionaire himself. Pride fluttered quietly, but beneath it, nerves hummed through her chest. Pierce Tower loomed above the financial district, a glass and steel monolith that reflected both the morning light and the weight of expectation. Inside, the polished floors gleamed under fluorescent lighting, and the hum of air conditioning mingled with distant elevator chimes. Grace moved through the lobby, clutching her tote bag, noting the subtle glances of colleagues who whispered behind cupped hands. Their eyes tracked her, some with curiosity, others with unspoken judgment. The memo waiting in her inbox added a tangible heaviness to her step. It concerned an acquisition that included the building housing Harbor House Community Center, her second home and the place she had come to invest herself in quietly for months. If the deal proceeded, seniors' art classes would vanish, job clinics for veterans would close, and the community she had grown to love would be displaced. The thought knotted her stomach. Noah Caldwell, the CFO, had already begun framing the gala incident as a security concern, the language polished and precise, the kind that carried intimidation under the guise of procedural concern. He did not approach her directly, but made sure that memos, emails, and half-smiles communicated his expectation. Grace should tread lightly. She felt the invisible pressure in the crisp air of the office, in the subtle shift of chairs in conference rooms, in the sidelong glances of assistants who once smiled warmly, now measured their steps around her. She had long been accustomed to corporate politics, but this morning it felt sharper, more dangerous. By the time she returned home, the city had begun its full awakening. Delivery trucks rumbled over uneven pavement. The smell of fried breakfast and roasted coffee beans drifted from corner cafes. Her neighbor, Beth Carter, called out from her doorway, hands full of laundry, a mug of tea steaming in one hand. Beth's laugh was steady, grounded. "Don't let them steal your courage," she said, words simple, sturdy, and comforting. Grace nodded, managing a small smile, feeling the warmth of ordinary kindness amidst the brewing storm. In her apartment, she reheated the casserole she had prepared the night before, the savory aroma grounding her in the moment. Ethan, her younger brother, sat at the small kitchen table, reviewing a stack of applications for positions he hoped would give him stability after his service. He looked up briefly, his blue eyes calm but wary, sensing his sister's tension even before she spoke. Grace smiled faintly, offering a few words of encouragement. Inside, her heart was a mixture of worry and determination. Fear hummed under her ribs. Yes, but beneath it, a stubborn calm she had learned to carry through years of quiet struggle. Her phone buzzed again. The meeting notice in her inbox had been updated. She had expected HR, the familiar faces and neutral voices, perhaps a cautionary lecture. Instead, it now read, Alexander Pierce requested her presence in his private office. No agenda. The words blinked on the screen, a pulse of urgency and uncertainty. Her fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating, before she slid the phone into her pocket. The gravity of the moment settled over her, heavier than the winter coat she adjusted against the chill of her apartment. She packed her bag carefully, making sure her notebooks, pens, and a small water bottle were in order. Each item felt like a talisman, ordinary objects that somehow gave her steadiness. The walk to the elevator was deliberate. She pressed the button, feeling the steel panel cool beneath her fingers. The ascent was measured, the numbers on the indicator changing slowly. Each tick a second she could not reclaim. She thought of Harbor House, of the seniors who painted on paper thin as their patience, of the veterans learning to translate experience into opportunity. Their faces gave her courage, tempered by awareness of the stakes. The city blurred outside the tall glass as the elevator climbed, reflections of streetlights and snowflakes mingling with the fluorescent interior. Every floor passed like a heartbeat. Grace's mind returned repeatedly to last night, to the moment she had spoken up, to the hush that followed, and to the subtle acknowledgement from Alex Pierce himself. She had taken a stand, and though it was small, it mattered. But now, standing on the precipice of an uncertain encounter with the CEO, that same resolve felt fragile. Her fingers tightened on the strap of her bag as the elevator reached the top floor, the doors sliding open with a soft whisper. The hall smelled faintly of polished wood and lemon cleaner, a corporate antiseptic she had walked past countless times without thought. Today, Each detail felt magnified. Each reflection in the glass panel along the corridor reminded her of the difference between appearing confident and being unshakable. She took a breath, letting it fill her lungs, steadying her thoughts. The air in the hallway was warmer than outside, but the chill of expectation lingered. She adjusted her blazer, smoothed her hair, and stepped forward, feet soundless on the carpeted floor, as if each step could carry both courage and consequence. The office door at the end of the hall loomed, a threshold between the ordinary day and something entirely uncertain. She hesitated only briefly, knowing the moment was hers to meet, whether she stumbled or stood firmly. The soft click of her shoes seemed unusually loud, echoing faintly in the quiet hallway. And then, just before turning the final corner, Grace's phone vibrated once more, a reminder blinking insistently. She paused, glanced at the screen, and felt a strange alignment of nerves and determination. The meeting was not just about her actions. It was about the people she cared for, about the center, about fairness and integrity in a world that often seemed to reward only power and wealth. Her heart beat steadily now, a rhythm in sync with the resolve she had cultivated quietly over the years. The elevator doors behind her closed with a muted thud, leaving her facing the threshold, ready to meet whatever waited beyond. As Grace steps toward Alex Pierce's office, the weight of her choices presses alongside a strange, growing anticipation. She knows the encounter could alter more than her career. It could affect every life tied to Harbor House. The moment is silent, tense, but charged with the possibility of change. Grace Whitman's shoes clicked lightly against the polished floor of Pierce Tower as she approached the glass office. The city spread out beneath her like a patchwork of rooftops and streets dusted with winter frost. Her mind replayed the events of the previous night, the gala, the hush that followed her voice, the subtle recognition from Alex Pierce. Every step she took was measured, her fingers curling around the strap of her bag. She had anticipated lectures, perhaps even reprimand, but nothing prepared her for the quiet weight of expectation that hung in the corridor before the office door. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside. Alex Pierce was seated behind his massive desk, his hands folded over paperwork that could have dictated the fates of dozens of employees. He did not rise to greet her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were tired, betraying more humanity than the blog posts and gossip columns had ever suggested. Grace felt a flicker of uncertainty. She had imagined a towering figure, imperious and cold. Instead, she saw a man who had carried the burdens of the company with a visible, almost human strain. The view behind him, the city stretching into the morning haze, made it easy to forget the ground, but Grace's thoughts were rooted firmly in reality. Every senior, every volunteer, every child who relied on Harbor House was part of what mattered. She closed the door behind her and stood with her hands clasped in front of her. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of heating vents and the occasional distant chatter from the lobby. She drew a breath, steadying her heartbeat. Her mind rehearsed the words she had ready for a defensive explanation, for a justification of her stand. She thought of the banquet worker, his back slightly bent with age and exhaustion, the shame he had felt, and the courage it had taken simply to carry a tray. Her chest tightened. She knew she had acted rightly, yet the corporate machinery could crush the best intentions in moments. Alex finally spoke, not about her actions, not about what had happened in the ballroom. Instead, he asked the worker's name. Grace blinked, startled. The shift was subtle, but profound. Her body relaxed slightly. His concern was not about her defiance. It was about fairness. He listened intently as she gave the name, describing the worker's diligence and the minor mishap that had prompted the executive's harshness. Alex nodded slowly, absorbing each detail. He reached for the phone on his desk and made a call, speaking in measured tones that carried authority but no aggression. Grace listened, noting the way his voice commanded attention without raising volume. Within moments, the bullying executive's status was altered. He had been suspended pending review. A hardship fund was authorized to support service staff at company events, a tangible acknowledgement that their work mattered and that abuses would not be overlooked. The decision on Harbor House was paused. Alex would visit the property personally before any further action. Grace felt a strange flutter in her stomach, cautious hope tempered by disbelief. Employees nearby watched on intranet feeds as the updates posted. The office lit up with cautious relief, but also louder whispers of skepticism. Grace didn't offer thanks. Words felt inadequate, unnecessary, and beside the point. She stepped back from the desk, absorbing the quiet intensity of the moment. Sensing that something had shifted in the air, a door had opened where before there had only been a wall. She turned to leave, noting the subtle shifts around her. Colleagues avoided direct eye contact, some with respect, others with unease. The hum of the office felt different now. Policies had been enacted, consequences acknowledged, and yet the real test had only begun. Grace understood that change was incremental, and her role in this moment was only the first of many ripples. Alex spoke again, this time more casually. He informed her that he intended to visit Harbor House, to see the space and the programs firsthand. Grace's thoughts raced. The opportunity was immense. Her heart lifted, but she did not allow herself to hope too fully. The corporate machine was vast, and Noah Caldwell was already observing, smiling for the cameras, moving pieces silently across a chessboard only he fully understood. The tension in the office was palpable. Grace felt a mix of excitement and wariness, knowing that every action she took now would be magnified under scrutiny. The meeting ended without ceremony. Grace gathered her belongings, folding a notebook neatly, tucking pens into their holder. Her actions were deliberate, measured, each movement a quiet assertion of control in a space where she often felt unseen. She walked toward the elevator, feeling the hum of activity around her, the distant sound of ringing phones and footsteps echoing against the polished floors. Outside, the city waited, indifferent and sprawling, yet brimming with possibilities. Once home, she printed a list of Harbor House programs for Alex to see: the veterans' job training schedules, the seniors' art classes, the tutoring sessions for children whose homes were quiet in the late afternoon. The pages spread across her small kitchen table, forming a map of community impact that numbers alone could not convey. Grace studied each entry, considering the outcomes, the faces of those involved, and the subtle ways that her advocacy might influence the next steps. Her heart thrummed with purpose and apprehension. She felt the familiar intertwining of responsibility and hope, the delicate balance between action and consequence. The night settled around her apartment. Snow had begun again, settling softly on the window ledge, muffling the distant sounds of traffic. Grace looked at the list one final time before closing the printer. She understood that the unthinkable gesture had set the stage for a series of decisions that could either protect or endanger everything she valued. Yet, for the first time in a long while, she felt the faint pulse of possibility a leader could choose decency, and one voice could illuminate a path others had overlooked. The streets outside remained slick and quiet, reflecting the faint city lights, as if holding their breath in anticipation. Grace folds the printed pages, stacking them neatly, ready to present a tangible argument when Alex visits Harbor House. She knows the coming days will be filled with scrutiny, decisions, and strategy. But tonight she allows herself a quiet thought. Maybe this is the start of real change. The scent of soup mingled with the faint tang of Elmer's glue, and beneath it all was a pervasive sense of hope. Grace Whitman stepped through the doors of Harbor House Community Center, her boots making soft, scuffing noises against the worn tile floor. Alex Pierce followed behind her, without a tie, sleeves rolled up slightly, a casual contrast to the formality of the gala from only days ago. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and unassuming, bathing the center in a uniform glow that revealed both the imperfections and the heart of the place. Children read aloud in a small classroom, their voices blending with the occasional scrape of a chair and the scratch of pencil on paper. A veteran, clutching a folder and practicing answers, rehearsed confidently in front of a vending machine, pausing to glance at Grace and Alex with a tentative smile. The simplicity of the setting, the ordinary cadence of activity, contrasted sharply with the skyscraper offices Alex had left behind. Grace walked deliberately, guiding him through the pantry line where shelves held donated goods neatly arranged, and the coat rack that carried more need than wool, each jacket representing a story of someone seeking warmth in a bitter winter. Evelyn Harper, 62, met them near the back. She offered Alex a firm handshake, then stepped back with a quiet authority that seemed to make the billionaire's presence irrelevant. To her, he was simply another human visitor. The measure of character would not be in status, but in attention and respect. She explained in steady tones what kept the doors open: donations that arrived just in time, volunteers who gave more than they had, and the staff who worked tirelessly to maintain dignity. She spoke also of the worries that haunted her nights, the heating bills that climbed each winter, the delicate balance of schedules that could crumble if one volunteer was sick, the fragility of a system built largely on goodwill and persistence. Alex moved slowly, letting his gaze wander across the room, absorbing details he had never noticed from a distance. He paused at a bin of tools tucked against a wall, wooden handles smooth from repeated use, steel edges dulled but reliable. He ran a thumb over the worn wood, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. They reminded him of the shuttered mill where his father had worked in western Massachusetts, a factory that had fed families but never kept the company's promise to the town. His breath caught, and he blinked slower, as though a window within him had opened, exposing a vulnerability he rarely allowed to surface. Grace led him to the tutoring room, where hand-me-down laptops hummed softly under the glow of desk lamps. Each station was meticulously organized, yet bore marks of constant use: scratched corners, stickers peeling, keyboards worn from repeated typing lessons. The children navigated the machines with focus and care. Alex bent slightly, examining one screen, then another, pausing to watch a young girl trace her finger along the edge of a geography map displayed on a lesson. He asked a question about the hours of operation and the scheduling of tutors. Grace answered precisely, quietly proud of the smooth system she had helped maintain. A local reporter appeared, camera poised, eyes eager to catch an image of billionaire benevolence. He stepped forward, notebook ready, clearly hoping to turn this moment into a narrative of optics, a story that would portray Alex's visit as a spectacle rather than a genuine inquiry. Evelyn, however, maintained her calm authority. She did not allow the camera or the reporter to dictate the tone. She spoke to Alex, not to the lens, and Grace followed her lead, keeping the tour practical and specific. They moved past the volunteer stations, the kitchen prep area, the small reading nook, always attentive to the flow of activity and the people inhabiting the space. This was not a photo. It was a living, breathing community. Alex's expression softened as he watched. He began asking questions that startled Grace for their specificity: the monthly utility costs, the winter heating expenses, the price of fresh produce per week, the rate of volunteer engagement, and the number of families served each month. These were not the numbers he needed for board presentations or profit projections. These were the numbers that mattered to the people. Grace noted his meticulous attention, the care in his tone, and the way he wrote details in a small notebook he carried loosely in his hand. He listened, not for appearance, but for understanding. Each question revealed that he was looking at the operations, not the optics. The children continued their reading, unaware of the significance of the billionaire's visit, yet they were the ones shaping the purpose of the questions. The veterans paused in their interviews to watch briefly, nodding to themselves, sensing that their work and presence were acknowledged without pretense. Volunteers moved quietly, adjusting seating, offering gentle guidance, all without altering the rhythm of the center. Grace observed each movement, the subtle coordination that allowed the center to function. She felt a quiet pride in the invisible work that made this place run, and in the fact that Alex was seeing it, truly seeing it. The tour ended near the front doors, where donated coats hung, each labeled with a volunteer's careful writing. Alex looked at Grace, nodded once, and without a word to the reporter, asked about the total cost of providing for each family, including food, heating, and winter clothing. Grace supplied the data, numbers precise. informed by weeks of careful record-keeping. His eyes did not glance toward the camera. They stayed on her, and in that moment, the center's ordinary details became extraordinary. The work, the schedules, the cold mornings, the late nights, the small victories, everything was accounted for, acknowledged, and respected. Outside, the reporter called out a question about the acquisition, hoping for a statement or a soundbite. Alex did not answer. Snow began to fall, large flakes drifting silently against the windows. The city outside blurred into white and gray. Grace watched him, noticing the way his posture softened, how his shoulders, usually squared with authority, now relaxed subtly. The snowflakes clung briefly to his coat, melting slowly, as if the world itself paused to watch the convergence of two very different lives on one ordinary street. She felt the hum of possibility, a quiet sense that the course of events might yet bend toward what was just and humane. The snow thickened as Grace stood at the edge of the center's doorway, thinking of the upcoming discussions, the decisions that would need to be made, and the fact that Alex's questions had revealed a man willing to see more than just profit. She knew the city outside would keep moving, but inside, a shift had begun that neither of them could ignore. Some battles arrived with the subtlety of a whisper. Others landed with the weight of a hammer. Grace Whitman had learned both in her life quiet indignities, moments when the world seemed too heavy for a single person to shift, but nothing prepared her for the morning inside Pierce Tower. The boardroom smelled faintly of polished wood and chilled air conditioning. Iced water glimmered in glasses lined neatly across the long table. Pens balanced with precision next to folders filled with projections and legal disclaimers. Grace took a slow breath and reminded herself that she was here not for appearances, but for principle. Noah Caldwell sat at the head of the table, the CFO's usual smile carefully arranged, teeth bright against the crisp lines of his suit. He spoke of fiduciary duty and responsibility to shareholders with a smooth, practiced cadence. Every word was precise, measured, polished. He pressed the urgency of the land deal that included Harbor House, the same property Grace had escorted Alex through days before. If the deal closed, the community center would be displaced, seniors' art classes would dissolve, and job clinics for veterans would vanish from the neighborhood. The language of duty disguised the reality of displacement, and Grace felt the familiar tight knot of anger and worry in her chest. While the meeting proceeded, anonymous tips reached a tabloid blog, smearing Grace in words that felt like sharp edges pressed to skin. They called her an opportunist with ties to activists, implying ulterior motives where none existed. Emails circulated quietly among the floor below and upper management alike, and Grace could sense the subtle shift in the office atmosphere. Half smiles, hesitant glances, careful avoidance of eye contact, each one a small test of her composure. She focused on keeping her posture steady, reminding herself that rumor and innuendo could not undo the integrity she carried silently. Alex Pierce moved through the same building with a different burden. Investor calls streamed into his ear, voices urgent and abstract, concerned only with quarterly charts, profits, and market trends. He listened carefully, nodding when required, yet his mind lingered on the models that he had analyzed in private, the calculations that revealed the human cost of decisions, often reduced to numbers. He adjusted assumptions, revisited projections, and allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The people affected by these decisions rarely had advocates in the corner offices. Grace, he thought, had stood for them even when it cost her peace of mind. Back at her desk, Grace quietly unwrapped a turkey sandwich she had brought from home. The mundane act of eating felt grounding amid the tension, anchoring her to ordinary needs while extraordinary pressures circled overhead. She opened emails from Harbor House volunteers, noting their plans for the coming week: grocery distributions, tutoring schedules, meal prep. Each note reminded her of the real stakes behind the memos and boardroom discussions. She typed measured responses, coordinating quietly, offering guidance without fanfare. The rhythm of ordinary care became a counterweight to the chaos unfolding around her. She paused to look out the office window. The city streets glistened under early winter light, the reflection of glass towers caught in puddles, a visual echo of the polished surfaces inside. She let her gaze drift for a moment, thinking of the veterans learning to translate service into opportunity, of children tracing their fingers over geography maps, of seniors painting winter scenes in modest classrooms. Each life was a node in the delicate web she had spent weeks protecting. The office noise returned. A clerk shuffled papers. A phone rang faintly. An assistant cleared her throat politely. Grace returned her attention to the screen, aware that every keystroke and response carried weight. Minutes stretched into a slow, deliberate cadence. Then, HR arrived with a neutral expression that masked the implication of their presence. Grace looked up from her notes, recognizing the subtle shift. The conversation was brief, professional, devoid of anger or overt threat. Yet the message was clear. She was placed on paid administrative leave pending review of conduct. The words landed softly on paper, but felt like exile. She exhaled slowly, tasting the cold air of office separation, sensing how ordinary policies could impose extraordinary isolation. The act appeared neutral to outsiders. For her, it carried the tension of being silenced, a test of endurance in a corporate landscape that measured courage differently than she did. Leaving the office that morning, she navigated the hallways with care, nodding quietly to colleagues who offered tentative greetings. Her bag felt heavier now, though it carried only her laptop, a notebook, and pens. Each step seemed deliberate, measured against the reality that she was moving into a space where influence existed, but needed advocacy to reach those without voice. She rode the elevator down, each number passing like a heartbeat she could not reclaim. The doors opened to the lobby, and she stepped out into the early light, a gray, wintered morning that smelled faintly of salt and exhaust. Returning to her South Boston apartment, the familiar smells greeted her: the faint scent of reheated casserole, brewed coffee left to cool overnight, the mingling of detergent and worn wood in the flooring. She set her bag down carefully, arranged her papers, and began to line up sticky notes on her kitchen counter. Bills, Harbor House tasks, reminders for Ethan, the veteran's job applications, all neatly organized in a grid of ordinary concern. She did not erase anything. Each note was a marker of responsibility, a visual affirmation that she would not shrink, would not avoid accountability, and would continue to act within the space she could influence. Grace paused, letting her hands hover over the notes. The weight of the morning pressed against her, but beneath it lay a quiet, stubborn resolve. The hallway outside hummed faintly with city life, a neighbor walking to work, a child's laughter from a nearby apartment, the distant siren of an emergency vehicle. She absorbed these sounds, letting them anchor her to reality, grounding her in a rhythm that reminded her while policies could pause activity, while rumors could sting, the work and the people remained, and she would remain with them, present, deliberate, and unflinching. The afternoon sunlight angled through the window, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. She traced her fingers along the sticky notes, reading them silently. Each one reminded her of the human connections behind the data, behind the memos, behind the corporate decisions that threatened to sweep through the neighborhood like a winter storm. Grace exhaled and leaned back slightly, eyes resting on the familiar neighborhood outside. She felt the quiet pulse of determination in her chest, a rhythm that echoed the heartbeat of Harbor House itself. The challenge was only beginning, but she was ready. Grace sat amid the organized sticky notes, aware that the administrative leave was only a pause in the story. The coming days would test her resolve, but she would face them fully prepared to advocate, coordinate, and protect the community she had chosen to serve. The sun had not yet risen over Boston when the first emails hit inboxes across Pierce Langford Holdings. The message was simple, direct, yet carried a weight that seemed unusual for corporate correspondence. Staff opened it, eyebrows raised, reading carefully. It outlined a new staff dignity policy and a vendor code of conduct. Words like respect, accountability, and fairness were highlighted, not as lip service, but as expectations woven into the fabric of company operations. Change was louder in writing. the kind of quiet power that could not be ignored, even by those who preferred business as usual. Grace Whitman sat at her kitchen table, mug of decaf cooling beside her, a stack of unpaid heating bills nearby. She read the policy letter twice, then a third time, letting each sentence sink in. Pride mingled with wariness. She had seen promises before, words on paper that disappeared when corners were cut or attention waned. Yet something about this felt different. The tone was intentional, grounded, and most importantly, actionable. Alex Pierce had chosen to put accountability on display, to ensure that the dignity of employees and volunteers mattered beyond mere optics. The emails from older employees began to arrive shortly afterward. One recounted a decades-old incident where a minor mistake had been met with excessive scolding. Another detailed years of quiet observation, small acts of unfairness that had gone unnoticed by leadership. Relief tinged each message. Grace read them slowly, tracing the careful words, feeling the weight of years of silenced voices finally being acknowledged. She leaned back in her chair, allowing the moment to settle around her, the quiet satisfaction tempered by awareness that policy alone was not enough. It required follow-through, courage, and vigilance. Later that morning, Alex walked to Harbor House, leaving behind the polished corridors and glass towers. He arrived after hours, no press, no cameras, just the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint scent of cleaning supplies and old paint. He moved through the pantry and tutoring rooms with quiet observation, leaving a donation in his father's name. Each coin, each check, each gesture carried intention. This was not a photo op, a press release, or an article for the business magazine. It was a tangible commitment, small but meaningful. The veterans at the center would not see him, but the staff did, and the act spoke volumes to them about the values guiding leadership. As he walked home, the cold air bit at his lungs, reminding him of winters past. Memories surfaced: the mill where his father had worked, the long hours, the grinding expectation of productivity above all else, and the sacrifices made by those who never appeared on spreadsheets. The snow crunched lightly beneath his shoes, each step a reminder of the balance between power and responsibility, influence and humanity. He breathed deeply, letting the sting settle, feeling the weight of choices that extended beyond profit margins and into lives. Back in her apartment, Grace reviewed the implications of the new policies. Her kitchen table had become a temporary headquarters. The unpaid bills, the volunteer schedules, and the printed lists of Harbor House operations were arranged carefully. The decaf mug steamed faintly in the winter chill. She reflected on the work ahead, ensuring that policy translated into practice, checking that the dignity promised in emails became reality on the floors of the company and within the community spaces she cared for. Pride was present, yes, but so was caution. She understood that words were only the first step. As the morning progressed, news from the board filtered in. Noah Caldwell had maneuvered quickly, securing 3 votes to fast-track the acquisition of Harbor House property and to investigate Alex for dereliction of duty. The term felt formal, almost sterile, yet the implications were potent. The fight was not over. Grace felt the familiar tension settle in her chest, a reminder that change was never linear and that courage was tested most when the stakes were invisible to the public eye. She looked at the sticky notes she had arranged earlier, the small but meaningful reminders of responsibilities and relationships. Each note seemed to pulse with significance, a quiet counterbalance to the corporate maneuvering occurring above her. Alex's office buzzed with calls and messages, yet he remained focused on what mattered: the people affected by decisions, the integrity of processes, and the tangible measures of dignity. He drafted further notes, coordinated with internal teams, and planned site visits, all while the board debated and external pressures mounted. Grace, sitting miles away in her modest apartment, felt a resonance with his approach, a quiet validation that advocacy and leadership could intersect when guided by principle. Evening fell slowly, the city's skyline dimming under a blanket of winter gray. Grace closed her laptop, took a sip of the now lukewarm decaf, and allowed herself a moment to breathe. The kitchen smelled faintly of reheated casserole, the aroma grounding her amid the swirl of policy, boardroom politics, and community responsibility. She reflected on the paradox of influence. One man's gesture had set a framework, but it required countless others, staff, volunteers, advocates to sustain it. Words alone were insufficient. Proof resided in the careful daily actions, the follow-up calls, the attentive oversight, the willingness to intervene when injustice appeared. Finally, a new notification blinked on her screen, a calendar invite for an emergency board session. The subject line struck with the weight of a gavel. Grace stared at it, the edges of her vision tinged with anticipation and uncertainty. She thought of Harbor House, of the children, the veterans, the volunteers, the seniors, and herself. The responsibility was vast, and the challenges ahead were daunting. Yet she felt the quiet pulse of determination that had carried her through countless moments before, grounding her in purpose and the resolve to continue. Grace set her mug aside, eyes lingering on the blinking calendar invite. Tomorrow would demand strategy, presence, and courage. But tonight, she allowed herself the faint comfort of knowing that action had begun to ripple, that words were already translating into change. When power pushes back, it rarely announces itself with fury. It drafts resolutions in sterile boardrooms, files legal notices with methodical precision, and releases unfavorable news late on Fridays, when attention is minimal and speculation is rampant. Grace Whitman discovered this reality in the quiet hours of early morning, sipping tepid coffee in her South Boston apartment. The news had arrived via emails, press alerts, and whispered conversations that carried the weight of authority. The board had moved decisively, voting to censure Alex Pierce while accelerating the process to take over Harbor House. The subtle precision of their tactics left no room for misinterpretation. They intended to assert control, to signal consequences for deviations from the corporate expectations. Grace felt the sting sharply. A tabloid had run a piece insinuating financial improprieties in her family, connecting her to activist networks with no evidence beyond conjecture. The words scrolled across her phone screen, each sentence a blade that cut into the quiet confidence she had cultivated over years of principled work. She pressed her lips together, exhaling slowly, letting the tension roll off in measured breaths. It was the kind of attack that sought to destabilize her, to make personal life a target in a professional dispute. Yet she also felt a subtle, steadying current, a reminder that she had allies, invisible perhaps, but strong in presence. Beth Carter appeared shortly after, carrying a steaming bowl of homemade soup. The aroma of roasted vegetables and herbs filled the apartment, a quiet reminder of ordinary care amidst extraordinary pressure. She hugged Grace briefly, the embrace firm and comforting. "Don't let them shake you," Beth said softly, voice steady. Her warmth provided a contrast to the cold precision of emails, resolutions, and gossip. Grace felt the tremor in her center ease slightly, grounded by the tangible act of neighborly kindness. She thanked Beth with a nod, holding the warmth in her chest as she carried the bowl to the table. Meanwhile, at Harbor House, Evelyn Harper received a legal notice 30 days to vacate. The words on the paper were cold, factual, and immovable. Evelyn's hands trembled only slightly as she held the envelope, but her eyes reflected years of experience balancing hope against the harsh realities of bureaucracy. Grace called her immediately, exchanging quiet, urgent words. They discussed contingency plans, schedules for volunteers, and the fragile logistics that held the center together. Each item was a potential fracture point, a reminder that the human element could never be fully predicted by law or corporate edict. Ethan Whitman attempted to hide his concern. He kept his voice low, his movement steady, but Grace noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the wariness in his posture, the brief pauses before answering questions about daily errands, betrayed his worry. Grace allowed herself a small, private sigh, acknowledging that their household, though small, carried the same weight of consequence as the larger decisions being made miles away in glass towers. She poured another cup of coffee, letting the warmth seep into her palms, grounding her in the present while her mind wrestled with the unfolding complexity. Across Boston Harbor, Alex Pierce sat behind the window of his office, the water dark and iron-like under the morning light. Ships moved sluggishly, their paths marked by ripples and trails that reflected the shifting sky. He considered the cost of leadership, not in numbers, but in consequence. Reputation, influence, authority all could be measured in headlines, stock price, and shareholder approval. Yet the questions that truly mattered were far quieter. What was the value of a community, of children learning to read in warmth and safety, of veterans finding their voices, of a center where dignity was cultivated alongside opportunity? His fingers tapped lightly on the desk, a rhythm that mirrored the pulse of decisions yet to be made. Alex weighed profit against principle, the tangible wealth of shareholders against the intangible wealth of human connection. He thought of Grace, her steadfastness, her unwillingness to compromise integrity for convenience. Her courage had illuminated the cost of ignoring ordinary people, and he felt the pull of responsibility deepen. He understood that defiance would carry risk-board backlash, media scrutiny, and the potential of career-altering consequences. Yet, compliance felt like a betrayal of everything he had glimpsed at Harbor House. The clarity of his choice crystallized slowly, measured against the stakes and the quiet faces of those he was determined to protect. Noah Caldwell, ever precise, moved with the subtle efficiency of a chess master. His smile, recorded on cameras and social feeds, masked the quiet orchestration of moves across the corporate board. He communicated, reassured, and manipulated narratives, ensuring that the transition of authority and the acceleration of the Harbor House acquisition appeared rational, necessary, and above reproach. The layers of action were subtle, but effective. Grace observed the unfolding events from a distance, aware that ordinary courage often collided with unseen machinations. Late afternoon brought word from Alex. He would publicly defy the board's timeline. He would act in alignment with principle, regardless of corporate backlash. The words traveled quickly through channels, reaching Grace and the team at Harbor House. They carried weight, reverberating through emails, whispers, and informal meetings. Courage, she realized, could cascade through networks when paired with deliberate action. Yet the implications of defiance meant heightened exposure to scrutiny, amplified risk, and a test of endurance for everyone involved. Still, the decision sparked a ripple of cautious hope in her chest, a quiet reminder that integrity could manifest even in the most challenging circumstances. Grace spent the remainder of the evening organizing her thoughts, aligning her priorities for the week ahead. Volunteer schedules, community needs, personal responsibilities all arranged carefully in notebooks and sticky notes. Each list represented tangible steps forward, a buffer against the intangible pressures of media, gossip, and corporate maneuvering. She sipped her coffee slowly, letting the warmth linger, acknowledging the moment of pause before the next wave of challenges. The city outside continued its rhythm, indifferent and persistent. Yet within her apartment, a quiet strategy was taking shape. A press conference was scheduled on the Massachusetts State House steps. The weather forecast predicted sleet. Grace, poised amid her notes, could only imagine the glare of cameras, the public scrutiny, and the decisions that awaited, knowing that the real test of courage and conviction was yet to come. The microphone felt cold against Alex Pierce's palm. The air on the Massachusetts State House steps was damp, the slick stone underfoot reflecting the gray sky above. Reporters jostled at the front, notebooks poised, cameras trained. Their questions were sharp, searching for drama, for the kind of story that made headlines rather than hearts. Alex took a measured breath, straightened his coat, and let the silence hang for a beat longer than necessary. The cold wind tugged at the edges of papers in his hands, flapping softly against the lectern. He spoke clearly, deliberately. The company would place a moratorium on all evictions linked to Pierce Langford Holdings. Furthermore, A third-party ethical review would examine the policies and practices surrounding property acquisitions and community displacement. His voice did not waver, though inside he felt the full weight of the choice. Markets reacted within minutes. Stock tickers dropped, headlines flashed, and analysts murmured over conference calls. The cost of principle was immediate and visible. Grace Whitman stood near the edges of the press throng, bundled in her winter coat. She watched the scene unfold, careful not to intrude on the performance, yet keenly aware of what it represented. Alex had made a public declaration that aligned with the principles she valued: dignity, fairness, and the human consequences of corporate actions. And yet, she also felt the sting of personal implication. The whispers of reporters, the glare of cameras, the murmurs among board members, none of it was kind to those who had been associated with the stand. Noah Caldwell moved strategically, his expression composed yet sharp. He immediately called for a leadership vote, exploiting the moment of vulnerability to press for control. Grace's chest tightened as she observed, sensing the subtle orchestration that would attempt to reverse or undermine the decision. She had no desire to stain the clarity of the moment with her presence or commentary. Quietly, she packed her desk. Papers were stacked carefully, pens aligned, folders clipped. Her security badge was placed in a small envelope, neat and deliberate, a small ritual of closure. The office smelled faintly of brewed coffee and paper, ordinary smells that carried weight against the extraordinary pressures pressing in. Alex offered a personal choice that few expected. He would place himself on unpaid leave rather than authorize actions that would betray neighborhoods dependent on their stability. His eyes scanned the steps, the reporters, the city beyond. People would label him reckless. Others would call him brave. The decision, like the wind, did not care for labels. It existed as a singular act of conscience, measured against consequence and principle. He felt the weight of both, but he also felt a strange clarity, the resolve to act as he believed necessary, irrespective of applause or censure. As the press released their statements, questions were shouted from all directions. Alex answered some, paused on others, and left gaps where honesty and principle required silence. His walk from the steps was deliberate. He refused a driver. The cold air hit him with each step, reminding him of earlier winters, of simpler lessons learned from family and place. Each breath was visible, the condensation briefly floating before dispersing. He felt the stinging clarity of exposure, vulnerability paired with determination. Grace, back at her small apartment, felt the contrast of her own quiet world. She dialed Evelyn Harper, the director of Harbor House, and arranged a meeting for later that evening. There was a file box waiting on the table at the center, filled with documents, schedules, and evidence of community impact. Grace stared at it briefly before turning her attention to daily life dinner. Emails from volunteers, a check-in with her brother Ethan, his shoulders tense as always. Betrayed worry he attempted to mask behind routine tasks. Grace gave him a nod and a small smile, the kind that acknowledged concern without dismissing it. Evelyn greeted her in the dimly lit office at Harbor House, the fluorescent hum faint but consistent. She placed a small lamp on the corner of the table, illuminating the documents in the file box. The stack represented weeks of activity, every volunteer schedule, every receipt, every note about children, seniors, and veterans whose lives depended on stability. Grace and Evelyn worked quietly, reviewing each page, organizing priorities, noting gaps that might exist, and confirming the resilience of their systems. The room smelled faintly of coffee, worn wood, and the faint scent of cleaning supplies, ordinary, grounding, human. Outside, the sleet began to fall lightly, hitting the windows in small patters. Grace listened to the rhythm, each drop a reminder of the stakes, the fragility of progress, and the relentlessness of external pressure. Conversations were soft, deliberate, focused on facts and procedures rather than reaction. They cataloged programs, schedules, and impacts. Every piece of paper, every sticky note represented a person, a life, a consequence. The weight was real, but so was their resolve. At intervals, Grace thought of Alex, walking through the streets, exposed to cold and criticism alike. She imagined the discussions at the boardroom, the silent calculations in Noah's office, the strategy shaping the next steps. She felt a blend of admiration and worry. Admiration for the courage displayed in public, worry for the potential consequences that would ripple through the center, through the community, through her own fragile sense of security. Hours passed. They moved methodically through files, each note and schedule a small victory of preparedness. Grace's hands felt the weight of responsibility physically, lifting folders, aligning stacks, and adjusting the box to ensure clarity. The act itself was ordinary, yet monumental in its significance. It grounded them, provided a structure to channel anxiety into action, and allowed for reflection amid chaos. They paused only briefly, taking sips of cooling coffee, noting the sleet's increasing rhythm against the windows. As night deepened, Grace reviewed the final notes, each representing a tangible element of the community they served. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, shoulders relaxed slightly, a soft sigh escaping her. "We've done what we can to be ready," she said quietly. Grace nodded, allowing herself a fraction of relief. Preparedness, she reminded herself, was not guarantee. It was defense against chaos. The real test awaited them, but for now, action, clarity, and documentation provided a outside. Sleet continued to fall, thin and persistent, as Grace and Evelyn sat at the Harbor House table. The file box before them held proof, preparation, and a quiet defiance. Both knew the thought lingering in the room. What if beneath the surface, there was something rotten would demand attention in the coming hours? Truth is patient. It hides in file boxes with labels curling at the edges, yellowed from years of handling. It sits in ledgers with pages that smell faintly of dust and old glue. Grace Whitman and Evelyn Harper approached the rows of cabinets in Harbor House with care. Each drawer a repository of months and years of community activity. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, and the winter afternoon cast long shadows across worn linoleum. Grace flexed her fingers, steadying herself, aware that the ordinary act of sorting papers could carry extraordinary consequences. They began methodically, receipts, invoices, spreadsheets, sticky notes carefully annotated by volunteers. Everything was cataloged. Grace noticed patterns that had gone unseen in day-to-day operations. Small discrepancies, repeated entries, subtle payments flowing through accounts marked with generic names. Evelyn leaned closer, tracing a faint pencil line connecting dates and amounts. "Look here," she said softly, pointing at a shadowed set of entries. Grace followed her finger and felt a ripple of understanding. Payments had been routed to an LLC with an anonymous address, one that, upon closer research, traced quietly back to Noah Caldwell. The channel had been set up to profit if Harbor House were displaced. The pattern was subtle, sophisticated, and intentional. They continued their examination, eyes scanning each line with painstaking attention. Grace's pen hovered over a ledger entry from last spring, noting an unusual timestamp. Evelyn cross-referenced it with volunteer schedules and community grants. The coincidence was too precise to be accidental. Grace's stomach tightened as the implications became clear. The initiative was not merely corporate maneuvering, it was a personal stake for Noah, a way to gain financially from the displacement of a community center. Her hand trembled slightly, a mix of anger and determination coursing through her. The retired accountant Evelyn had consulted confirmed suspicions. Similar financial flows existed in other projects across the city, each marked with the same careful obfuscation. Grace absorbed the weight of the information slowly, aware that she now held evidence of deliberate misconduct. Yet her mind returned repeatedly to Harbor House, to the seniors' art classes, to the veterans quietly practicing interview skills in corners, and to the children tracing letters and numbers. The stakes were not abstract, they were living, breathing, immediate. She understood the responsibility accompanying discovery. Grace carefully compiled the evidence. Each document was cataloged, summarized, and checked for authenticity. She set aside duplicates and minor annotations, focusing on the records that painted a clear picture of intent. Every page she touched carried significance beyond the paper itself. It represented accountability, transparency, and the possibility of justice. The room smelled faintly of old glue and cleaning supplies, ordinary yet grounding. Evelyn watched quietly, nodding occasionally, sensing Grace's careful balance between meticulousness and urgency. Once the files were ready, Grace contacted Alex Pierce. She described the findings in calm, measured detail, avoiding sensationalism. His reaction was deliberate, absorbing the information without immediate judgment or exclamation. Grace noted the intensity in his eyes, the subtle way he shifted in his chair as he processed the implications. Alex did not suggest leveraging the information for personal or corporate gain. Instead, he insisted on forwarding the evidence to regulators and copying the board's counsel, ensuring the process was transparent and legitimate. Grace felt a quiet awe. In that moment, she saw not just the power of a billionaire, but the shape of the boy he once had been, learning life's lessons in fairness and justice rather than ownership and profit. Alex's choice highlighted the core principle that guided him. Power was not to be used for personal advantage, but for remedy, accountability, and repair. Grace reflected on the contrast between what she had feared reprisal, corporate retaliation, and what she witnessed deliberate, ethical action that risked personal consequence. She saw the tension in his posture, the quiet weight of responsibility resting in the space between principle and expectation. He understood that decisions were measured not by what was won, but by what was made right. The regulators opened a formal probe shortly thereafter. The notification arrived in Alex's office, and a copy reached Grace. The language was precise, legalistic, and thorough. Yet the effect was immediate oversight, scrutiny, and the promise of impartial review. The board reacted with urgency, calling a special meeting to discuss both the ethical review and the emerging evidence. Whispers circulated across conference calls and internal emails. The narrative began to shift, the balance of public perception adjusting to reveal the discrepancies and hidden motives long obscured by routine operations. Grace processed the developments quietly. She returned to Harbor House that evening, walking past the snow-laden streets that glimmered under streetlights. The cold air pinched her cheeks, but the rhythm of her steps grounded her, reminding her of ordinary duty amidst extraordinary events. She arrived at the center, greeted briefly by volunteers preparing rooms for after-school programs. Their smiles were small, honest, and grounding a reminder of why diligence and ethical clarity mattered so deeply. Inside, the warmth of the center contrasted with the winter chill. She placed her coat on a chair and took a moment to breathe. The file box of findings rested on a table, carefully organized. She touched the papers gently, acknowledging the gravity of what they contained. Each entry, each ledger line, each supporting document carried a human story. Behind it, the work of volunteers, the care of staff, the lives of families and children. The weight of evidence was tangible, but so was the quiet power of verification and preparedness. As snow began to fall outside the public garden, the flakes landing softly against windows and streets, Grace's phone lit up with a message. The timing felt deliberate. The words were brief, almost casual in format, yet carried significance. It was time to talk. Not about headlines, not about gossip, not about corporate maneuvering, but about what a life could be when guided by integrity, courage, and action. The message resonated quietly, a call to consider the human consequences beyond legal proceedings and public scrutiny. Grace took a deep breath, leaning slightly back in her chair. The snow's hush filled the room, the gentle cadence of falling flakes mirroring her own steady heartbeat. She considered the coming conversation, aware of both risk and possibility. The weight of discovery had shifted, moving from concern and fear toward clarity and potential resolution. The lessons from the ledgers, the evidence of intent, and the ethical choices she had witnessed all coalesced into a singular understanding change, grounded in truth and care, could ripple outward even in the face of opposition. The snow in the public garden continued to fall as Grace stared at her phone, contemplating the conversation ahead. A chance to speak not to boards, headlines, or gossip, but to the potential of a life, a community, and the integrity of choices yet to be made. The park was hushed under the first snowfall of the season. Street lamps cast a soft halo along the path, illuminating the faint glint of ice on the frozen pond. Footsteps crunched gently on the thin layer of snow, each sound punctuating the quiet that seemed suspended over the city. Grace Whitman arrived first, her coat wrapped tightly, scarf tucked around her neck, gloves damp from brushing snowflakes off her shoulders. The cold stung briefly, a reminder of the winter air and the clarity it brought to the mind. She breathed slowly, inhaling the crisp scent of snow and pine, letting it ground her, steady her pulse. Alex Pierce appeared a few steps behind, hands in his coat pockets, sleeves slightly rolled to accommodate warmth. He paused at the edge of the frozen pond, looking down at the ice, its surface reflecting the soft glow of the lamps. Grace noted the absence of a tie, the casual posture, the way the snowflakes settled on his dark hair. There was no audience here, no cameras, no press, no board members watching the small unfolding scene. The moment was theirs, defined by quiet presence and the shared rhythm of steady breath. They spoke first of Harbor House, the work, the programs, the people who depended on the center. Words were deliberate but unpolished, carried in the rhythm of normal conversation. Alex asked Grace to help him build a foundation that would focus on veterans and community centers, beginning with Harbor House. He did not offer a formal speech, no scripted lines, no gestures for public consumption. He spoke with a calm clarity, describing what he wanted to do in terms of practical service and measurable support. The things that mattered in daily life: funding for programs, mentorship for veterans, sustainable support for volunteers and staff. Grace listened carefully. Her gloved hands rested lightly on her coat pockets, fingers flexing as she considered the offer. The ground under her boots was solid despite the thin layer of ice and snow. The steadiness was not only physical, but symbolic. She had spent years navigating challenges, observing consequences, balancing personal and professional responsibility. This moment, quiet and deliberate, gave her a rare sense of alignment, her values, her work, and her sense of purpose converging. She realized that saying yes was not about spectacle. It was about grounding herself in integrity and shared commitment. Alex spoke next of the personal responsibility. He acknowledged the power he wielded, the mistakes he had made, and the lessons he had absorbed from observing Grace's courage and the work at Harbor House. His words were unadorned, sincere. "I want to ensure that the people who need support most are the ones who see it first," he said. There was no fanfare, no effort to impress. He spoke of practical solutions, timelines, and the ethical decisions that guided him. Grace felt the clarity of purpose in his voice, the subtle weight of accountability that he carried without pomp or pretense. They discussed strategy quietly: paperwork, funding allocations, volunteer engagement. These were concrete elements of a larger vision. Alex shared his intentions for coordinating with local organizations, aligning resources efficiently, and maintaining transparency throughout the process. Grace offered insights based on her experience at Harbor House scheduling, prioritization, community engagement. The discussion was methodical, grounded in the minutiae of action, yet beneath the surface, it carried the weight of shared trust and emerging partnership. At intervals, they paused to watch the pond. Snow continued to fall in soft sheets, muting the city beyond the park, each flake landing on coat or hair, melting almost instantly, symbolized the impermanence of external concerns against the enduring value of deliberate commitment. Grace felt the rhythm of quiet reflection, the ebb and flow of responsibility and intention blending. Her thoughts returned to volunteers, children, and veterans, each life intersecting with decisions made in office and on steps, and now, here, in the quiet air of the park. Alex asked Grace to commit, not with ceremony or rings, not with audience or applause, but with a promise grounded in shared values. He extended the offer of partnership to lead the foundation together, to ensure accountability, to prioritize people above optics, profit, or press coverage. Grace considered the weight of the request. She reflected on the courage it had taken to speak publicly at the gala, to navigate corporate scrutiny, and to maintain integrity amidst rumors and pressure. The offer was practical, ethical, and aligned with the life she had built for herself and the community she loved. She responded with a measured nod, a quiet affirmation that did not need amplification. "Yes," she said, letting her voice carry softly over the crunching snow. The affirmation felt like grounding, a tether to the values she had maintained throughout the past weeks of upheaval. It was not an embrace of publicity, nor a spectacle, but a commitment to action, principle, and sustained service. The clarity of purpose resonated in the air, filling the spaces between the falling snowflakes and the distant city hum. They agreed to keep the moment private. No photographs, no announcements, no press coverage. The promise existed in the cold air, in warm breaths visible against the winter sky, and in the steady gaze shared between them. There was satisfaction in the privacy, a recognition that meaningful commitments do not require validation. The loudest part of this agreement would not be spectacle, but the tangible, persistent work that followed: programs funded, community strengthened, lives impacted. Grace felt the quiet reassurance of stability beneath her feet, the kind she had longed for since her youth. The snow, the lamps, the frozen pond all contributed to a sense of clarity and presence. Alex's steady, understated demeanor mirrored her own, the symmetry of commitment allowing both to anchor in values, not acclaim. The park, quiet and luminous, became the setting for a decision that would shape their work, their lives, and the community they served. The board meeting would begin at dawn, papers would be read, votes cast, and decisions made. Grace and Alex knew that the snow-covered streets and frozen pond were merely the beginning. The true test would be in the actions that followed and the integrity they maintained amidst the chaos of corporate scrutiny and public expectation. Justice did not arrive with fanfare or flashing headlines. It arrived in signatures on forms, in minutes recorded during meetings, in new rules designed to make future harm harder to conceal. Grace Whitman sat in a small conference room at Harbor House, the winter light falling through the blinds in long slats across the table. Papers were stacked neatly in front of her, ink still drying on documents that represented months of effort, courage, and painstaking observation. The hum of the heating system filled the background, ordinary and grounding, while the extraordinary weight of accountability settled in the air. Regulators had presented their findings with meticulous care. The evidence tying Noah Caldwell to the Shadow LLC was thorough, tracing the flows of funds, confirming ownership, and linking the transactions directly to his personal benefit in the event of Harbor House's displacement. The board's reaction had been immediate. Noah was removed from all duties and now faced charges that carried both legal and professional consequences. Grace felt a mixture of relief and lingering tension. It was validation for the diligence she had poured into examining ledgers, following paper trails, and advocating for transparency. Yet she also recognized that the process of justice, though precise, was far from simple. Several directors who had been complicit in the obstruction quietly resigned. Their departures were understated, but marked the beginning of structural change within Pierce Langford Holdings. Alex Pierce, reinstated under constraints he himself had proposed, moved through his office with a quiet authority, grounded by principles codified into policy. An independent ethics council had been established. Community impact metrics were now linked to executive bonuses, and reporting structures were transparent to ensure accountability. Grace watched him coordinate with teams, seeing a man who had learned to merge power with responsibility, and she felt a deep respect for the deliberate steps he had taken to safeguard both people and processes. Harbor House itself had found security. A long-term lease at below-market rates was signed, guaranteeing the center's presence in the community for years to come. Renovation funds were approved, modest, but sufficient to repair the roof, upgrade heating, and replace worn furniture. Grace walked through the rooms she had come to know intimately: the pantry line, the tutoring area, the art room. Volunteers moved quietly, reorganizing supplies and preparing for the week ahead. Evelyn Harper, 62, let out a soft sob in the corner, the kind of cry that leaders release when a heavy burden is lifted. Grace offered a hand to steady her, feeling the release of months of worry in Evelyn's shaking shoulders. Beth Carter arrived shortly after, bringing a potluck of casseroles, bread, and small desserts. The aroma of home cooking filled the center, blending with the faint smell of cleaning supplies and winter air seeping in through the front doors. Volunteers and staff gathered around tables, laughing softly, tasting food, and exchanging quiet congratulations. The simplicity of the meal contrasted with the complexity of the battles waged to maintain Harbor House's presence. Yet it carried a profound significance: relief, stability, and a shared sense of victory in the ordinary act of nourishment. Grace had accepted a new role as executive director of the Pierce Family Foundation. The position allowed her to work directly on community impact without entanglement in corporate operations, preserving independence and integrity. She organized files, prepared plans for upcoming initiatives, and coordinated with volunteers and community leaders. Each task was ordinary in appearance, but extraordinary in consequence. Every email, phone call, and meeting carried the weight of continued vigilance and the promise of sustained care. Alex and Grace met briefly in the renovated office space at Harbor House. They discussed future projects quietly, mapping out initiatives for veterans, children, and seniors without needing publicity or recognition. The moment was calm, focused, and purposeful. Grace noticed the steadiness in Alex's posture, the calm in his voice, and the alignment of intentions that had guided their decisions since the first confrontation at the gala. There was no need for spectacle. The work itself was the proof of values realized in action. The victory was practical rather than flashy. It was not about viral attention, trending hashtags, or dramatic photographs. It was about structures written down, processes codified, and policies implemented in a way that ensured sustainability. The weight of accountability, now formalized in documents and metrics, provided a foundation that would outlast individual presence or corporate changes. Grace observed quietly, appreciating the stability that came from deliberate, principled action rather than rhetoric or performative gestures. Evenings at Harbor House returned to their rhythm. Volunteers checked schedules, children practiced reading, veterans rehearsed interview skills, and the hum of the center felt steady and reassuring. Grace walked among the rooms, adjusting supplies, listening to soft conversations, noting small details: a chair slightly askew, a book spine worn from repeated use, the scent of fresh paint and new paper in the art room. Each observation grounded her in the tangible success they had achieved, the concrete difference between policy and practice. Alex coordinated with staff and directors, reviewing metrics, schedules, and outcomes, ensuring that oversight was maintained without interference. Grace watched him navigate the balance between corporate influence and community responsibility, the subtleties of leadership that required both power and humility. She felt a quiet affirmation. The combination of action, accountability, and deliberate care could sustain impact even when individual stakes were high and external pressures persistent. A date was circled on the paper calendar in the Harbor House office. It was not a ballroom wedding, not an elaborate affair, but a personal marker of commitment and celebration. Grace glanced at it while organizing files for the foundation. The simple notation carried weight and warmth, a reminder that life, even amid challenge and responsibility, included moments of personal joy and connection. The small circle on the calendar symbolized a merging of worlds: public action paired with private commitment, community responsibility intertwined with personal love. Volunteers, staff, and community members moved through the space with quiet satisfaction. They prepared for programs, tidied rooms, and shared simple moments of conversation. The smell of brewed coffee and baked goods lingered. The warmth of human connection, ordinary and consistent, provided a foundation upon which the center could thrive. Grace felt the weight of responsibility alongside the satisfaction of tangible achievement, a combination of vigilance, compassion, and everyday action that marked the difference between theory and practice. Grace looked at the circled date on the calendar. A wedding awaited, not grand, not public, but meaningful. It was a quiet marker of hope and partnership, a pause in a life devoted to community, integrity, and shared purpose. The gym smelled faintly of floor wax, warmed by the body heat of volunteers and families, with a subtle trace of pine from makeshift decorations. Folding chairs were lined up in neat rows, each one a temporary neighbor, holding the weight of anticipation and quiet excitement. Paper snowflakes spun slowly in the currents of warm air rising from the old vents, catching the sunlight that filtered through high windows and scattering fractured patterns across polished floors. The space, ordinary and utilitarian most days, had become a chapel for a day, a place where purpose and celebration intertwined seamlessly. Children moved between rows of chairs, carrying handmade centerpieces crafted from construction paper, pipe cleaners, and the occasional pine cones scavenged from outside. They placed them gently on tables that, during weekdays, held job applications and volunteer sign-in sheets, now transformed into symbols of festivity. Grace Whitman watched them with a quiet smile, noticing how careful they were not to knock over anything, how seriously they approached the task despite the whimsy of their creations. Their tiny hands, steady and deliberate, reminded her of the cumulative effect of small actions: care, attention, and purpose building something larger than the sum of its parts. Veterans, their uniforms neatly pressed, or winter coats draped over their chairs, served as ushers. They guided guests with a calm authority, checking names off lists and ensuring that pathways remained clear. Their presence added gravity and structure, an unspoken acknowledgement of service and responsibility. Each interaction was small but resonant: a nod, a handshake, a whispered instruction. Grace felt the weight of these ordinary gestures, each one anchoring the ceremony in the reality of lived experience rather than performance. Evelyn Harper, 62, stood at the front, her hands folded over a well-worn binder that had held schedules, budgets, and volunteer rosters through lean winters. Her voice was steady, carrying a warmth that belied the months of anxiety, paperwork, and late nights spent keeping the center afloat. She officiated with precision and care, reading from notes that were less formal text than a chronicle of the center's history, each word infused with meaning and memory. Grace noticed the faint tremor in Evelyn's hands, the subtle way her eyes flicked toward the assembled families and volunteers, and felt a rush of gratitude for the decades of commitment that had made this day possible. Alex Pierce stood beside Grace, his posture relaxed yet attentive. He smiled at the children placing their paper decorations, at the veterans ensuring order, at the volunteers preparing quietly for the ceremony. There was no pretense here, no cameras to impress, no audience beyond those whose lives had been touched by action, perseverance, and ethical leadership. Grace caught his eye and saw in it a reflection of shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the work that had led them to this moment. When it was time, they made their vows. The words were simple, direct, and profound. Promises to support each other were interwoven with commitments to the community, to the veterans, the children, and the families who had relied on Harbor House. Grace's voice was steady, carrying across the space without effort, while Alex's was equally measured, deliberate, and sincere. They spoke not only to each other, but to the space itself, acknowledging the accumulation of effort, courage, and care that had made the present possible. Each syllable landed softly, punctuating the day with intention and integrity. After the vows, the ceremony dissolved into quiet celebration. Volunteers helped arrange refreshments, families shared small conversations over coffee and pastries, and children continued to move with quiet purpose, ensuring the room remained tidy, even as laughter echoed gently. Grace felt herself buoyed by the ordinary diligence surrounding her, the careful placement of chairs, the smoothing of tablecloths, the steady guidance of veterans as they moved among the guests. These small, deliberate actions underscored the durability of the work they had done. Time passed softly, measured not by clocks, but by the rhythm of participation and care. Grace walked among the tables, noting the subtle changes since the first months after the acquisition threat. New programs had begun, quietly art classes expanded, tutoring schedules adjusted to accommodate more children, veteran mentorship programs formalized. Ethan Whitman moved with quiet confidence among the attendees, offering guidance and encouragement to other young veterans navigating employment challenges. Grace felt pride tempered by reflection. The work was ongoing, iterative, and deeply human. The Pierce Family Foundation, under Grace's direction, had begun funding job labs across New England. Cities she had never visited were now connected through modest grants, volunteer coordination, and systematic follow-up. She reviewed spreadsheets and progress reports briefly, noting each success and each adjustment, understanding that tangible outcomes were the most enduring legacy of their collective effort. Each number represented a person, a family, a life affected by consistent and deliberate action. Later, on a quiet morning at Cape Cod, Grace and Alex stood at the edge of the water, the horizon thinning to a delicate line. Waves lapped gently against the shore, and the cold air carried the faint scent of salt and pine. They spoke not of press coverage, not of corporate scrutiny, not of the years of tension that had preceded this calm. Instead, they discussed ledgers that listed names, not numbers, outcomes that mattered to individuals rather than shareholders. The conversation was practical, yet intimate, grounded in the continuity of care and the values that had guided them. Love, Grace realized, felt less like a surprise now, and more like a steady light, a constant presence in a life devoted to integrity and service. The day at Harbor House faded into evening. Volunteers tidied classrooms, checked lists, and prepared for the following week's activities. The gym, transformed for the ceremony, returned to ordinary use, yet retained a sense of significance. Folding chairs, paper decorations, and small artifacts of celebration reminded all present of the human impact of diligence and commitment. Grace moved quietly through the space, straightening a chair here, smoothing a tablecloth there, each action reinforcing the ordinary steps that sustained extraordinary work. Evelyn and Beth exchanged small glances across the room. Relief, subtle and quiet, lingered in the air. Tasks were completed, responsibilities managed, yet the awareness of what had been achieved settled gently upon everyone present. Grace watched the interplay of ordinary gestures and extraordinary consequence, noting how structure, care, and accountability could create outcomes that were both durable and humane. She felt a quiet satisfaction in witnessing the convergence of effort, values, and human connection. The snow continued to fall outside Harbor House. Grace and Alex, standing among the now tidy tables and chairs, felt the steady glow of purpose. The intention was simple: keep showing up, keep the doors open, keep the promises. The work, the love, and the care were ongoing, durable, and quietly luminous. Life often tests our courage in the quiet, ordinary moments rather than on grand stages. Grace Whitman's story reminds us that integrity is not measured by status or wealth, but by the willingness to speak up for what is right, even when the consequences are uncertain. Standing for dignity, advocating for others, and acting with consistent compassion can ripple far beyond the immediate moment, creating lasting change in communities, organizations, and relationships. Alexander Pierce's journey demonstrates that true power is meaningful only when paired with responsibility. Wealth and influence are not inherently virtuous. They become so when used to protect, uplift, and support others. Even those who seem unapproachable or untouchable can choose to act ethically, bridging gaps between worlds and making profound, positive impact. For those of us navigating the later stages of life, these lessons resonate deeply. It is never too late to take a stand, to mentor, to support, or to repair what was once overlooked. Everyday actions, careful listening, offering a helping hand, or confronting injustice can embody courage and integrity. Ultimately, Grace and Alex teach us that the most enduring legacy is built not on wealth or recognition, but on consistent, principled action, small acts of kindness, and the steadfast commitment to serve others. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this story with us. If you were inspired by Grace and Alex's journey, please give this video a like, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories that touch the heart and inspire action. Your support helps us keep sharing tales that matter.